After being unjustly evicted from her home by Officer David Clark, Tanya Jones is forced into homelessness with her 2 children. But life takes an unexpected turn when she meets Clark again at a community shelter. This time, not as a cop, but as a volunteer trying to make amends. As tensions simmer between them, they must work together to build a program that prevents future evictions. Can Tanya overcome her anger, and will Clark prove he's truly changed, or will their pasts pull them back into conflict? Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Tanya Jones had always believed that, no matter what, things would somehow work out. Life was never easy, juggling work, bills, and raising 2 children on her own, but she had faith. That faith, however, was shaken the moment she heard the knock at the door. It was the kind of knock that carried weight, deliberate and heavy. She froze halfway through unpacking the groceries, her heart sinking with a sudden wave of anxiety. Her kids, Malik and Keisha, stopped playing, sensing the tension in the air. "Tanya Jones?" A firm voice called from outside. Tanya cautiously opened the door, and standing before her were 2 uniformed officers. The one at the front, tall and stern-faced, held a clipboard and an official-looking piece of paper. His badge gleamed in the sunlight, and his presence filled the small porch with an air of finality. Tanya immediately recognized him, Officer David Clark. She'd seen him around before, patrolling the neighborhood in his cruiser, always detached and professional. "Yes, that's me," she said cautiously, her fingers tightening on the doorknob. Clark glanced down at the papers in his hand. "I'm Officer Clark. We're here with an eviction order." His voice was neutral, as if he were simply announcing the weather. "I'm afraid you and your children need to vacate the premises today." Tanya's heart skipped a beat. "Wait, what? There must be a mistake," she said, her voice wavering with panic. "I've been in contact with the landlord. I told him I just needed a little more time. I'm only behind by a few weeks because of some unexpected expenses." "I understand," Clark replied, though his tone was far from empathetic. "But the order is final. The landlord filed the paperwork, and we're here to enforce it. I'm sorry, ma'am, but you have to leave." Tanya's mind raced. The groceries on the counter, the laundry still folded in the corner, her kids' backpacks resting by the door, all the tiny, everyday things that made this place their home. She had fought hard to keep it together, doing everything she could to provide stability for Malik and Keisha, even when life kept throwing curveballs. Now, in a matter of minutes, it was all being taken away. Her voice cracked as she pleaded, "Please, just give me a few more days. I'll get the rent money together. I just need a little time." Clark shook his head. "There's nothing I can do. We're just following orders." His partner, standing silently beside him, shifted uncomfortably but didn't intervene. Tanya glanced back at her children, who stood in the doorway, their wide eyes filled with confusion and fear. Malik, only 7 years old, clutched his sister Keisha's hand. "Mama, what's happening?" he asked quietly, his small voice breaking Tanya's heart. She forced a smile, though her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. "We're going to be fine." But inside, she felt anything but fine. Clark checked his watch, growing impatient. "We can give you a little time to gather your things, but we have to clear the property today." Tanya nodded numbly, her hands shaking as she rushed inside. She grabbed a couple of backpacks and stuffed them with clothes, school supplies, and whatever essentials she could find. Malik and Keisha watched quietly, their trust in her unwavering, even though the world around them was collapsing. She wished she could protect them from this moment, shield them from the harsh realities of life, but there was no escape. Minutes later, Tanya stood at the door with her children, each carrying a small bag over their shoulders. She glanced around their home one last time, the faded couch where they read bedtime stories, the small dining table where they shared meals, the tiny cracks on the walls that felt familiar, like old friends. With a deep breath, she stepped outside, holding her kids' hands tightly. "Come on, sweethearts, let's go." Clark gave her a brief nod, though his expression remained neutral, almost indifferent. To him, it was just another eviction, just another task to check off his list before his shift ended. Tanya and her children, to him, were names on a file, not people with hopes, dreams, and struggles. As they stepped off the porch, Tanya's heart shattered. The life she had tried so hard to build for her children was slipping through her fingers, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. "Where are we going now, Mama?" Keisha asked, her small hand gripping Tanya's tightly. Tanya swallowed the lump in her throat and gave them the only answer she could. "We'll figure it out, baby. We always do." They walked down the street, leaving their home behind, carrying only the essentials and a heavy burden of uncertainty. Tanya's thoughts raced as she tried to think of where they could go, who they could turn to for help. But the truth was they had few options. Tanya's family lived far away, and most of her friends were struggling themselves. The realization settled heavily on her. They were alone in this fight. Clark watched them walk away, standing on the porch for a moment longer than necessary. There was no joy in his job today, only a hollow sense of duty. He had done what the law required, nothing more and nothing less. As far as he was concerned, his part in their story was over. But for Tanya and her children, the real battle was just beginning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Tanya led her kids to a nearby park where they could sit and catch their breath. The benches were cold, and the chill in the air made her pull her children closer. They huddled together as the first stars appeared in the sky, the weight of the day pressing down on them like a heavy blanket. Tanya stared up at the darkening sky, her mind swirling with fear, anger, and frustration. How could this have happened? How had things gotten so bad? She had always tried to do the right thing, work hard, pay her bills, and take care of her kids, but it hadn't been enough. Life, it seemed, was determined to knock her down. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a spark of resolve flickered within her. She couldn't afford to fall apart. Not now, not ever. Malik and Keisha were counting on her, and somehow she would find a way to get through this. She kissed her children's heads and whispered, "We'll be okay. I promise." They nodded sleepily, trusting her words without question. And as they drifted off to sleep on either side of her, Tanya sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the stars above. The night was long and cold, and the future was uncertain. But Tanya knew one thing for sure: this wasn't the end of their story, it was just the beginning. The night air was unforgiving, a biting chill that seemed to seep into Tanya's bones as she sat on the park bench with her two children huddled close on either side. Malik's head rested on her shoulder, and Keisha clung to her arm, her tiny fingers gripping her mother's sleeve even in sleep. The park, with its empty swings and darkened pathways, felt eerily quiet, as if the world itself had turned its back on them. Tanya adjusted her coat, wrapping it tighter around her children, wishing she could shield them from more than just the cold. Her heart ached with guilt. Guilt for failing them, for not being able to protect their home, for every time she had told them everything would be fine, only to find herself sitting on a bench with no plan for tomorrow. The city moved on around them. Cars hummed in the distance, streetlights flickered above, and people came and went, oblivious to the woman and her children sitting quietly in the shadows. Tanya had never felt so invisible. She thought back to the eviction earlier that day. Officer Clark's face flashed in her mind, not cruel but cold, detached. Just doing his job, she thought bitterly. But the way he had delivered the news without even a flicker of empathy burned in her chest. He hadn't seen them, not really. To him, they were just part of the system, another statistic, not a family with dreams, fears, and fragile hopes. As the night wore on, the harsh reality of their situation began to settle in. Tanya's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, hoping for a lifeline. A friend responding to her messages, someone offering a place to stay for the night. But it was just a notification about a bill that was now past due. She let out a long breath and tucked the phone away. Keisha stirred beside her, rubbing her eyes. "Mama, I'm cold," she whispered, her voice tiny and tired. Tanya kissed the top of her daughter's head. "I know, baby. I know. I'm sorry." Her voice cracked under the weight of those words, but she forced herself to smile. "We're going to find a place soon, I promise." Keisha nodded sleepily. Too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense her mother's struggle. "Okay, Mama," she whispered, before curling back into Tanya's side. Tanya fought back the tears that threatened to spill. She couldn't afford to cry. She needed to stay strong. For Malik, for Keisha, for herself. She knew that showing fear would only make things harder for them. But inside, her mind was racing, trying to figure out their next step. They couldn't sleep on the street again. They needed a plan. The next morning came slowly, the sun rising sluggishly over the horizon. Tanya's body ached from sitting upright all night, but she forced herself to stand and stretch, waking her children with gentle nudges. "Come on, sweethearts, let's get moving." Malik yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Where are we going, Mama?" "To find some help," Tanya said, more to herself than to her son. They walked through the streets, hand in hand, as Tanya scanned for any place that might offer them shelter or guidance. The city felt like a maze, its towering buildings and crowded sidewalks unfamiliar and indifferent. She tried calling a few friends again, but each attempt went to voicemail. Disappointment settled over her, but she shook it off. There had to be another way. Hours later, after wandering aimlessly, Tanya spotted a small building with a sign that read, "Community Shelter and Family Services." Relief washed over her like a wave. It wasn't much, but it was a start. She guided her children inside, where they were met by the warm scent of coffee and the hum of quiet conversation. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes approached them, her expression softening as she took in the sight of Tanya and her children. "Hi there," she said warmly. "I'm Mrs. Green, welcome. How can we help you today?" Tanya hesitated for a moment, pride holding her back. But the weight of her situation pushed her forward. We were evicted yesterday," she admitted quietly. "We need a place to stay, just for a night or two until I can figure something out." Mrs. Green's expression didn't change. There was no judgment in her eyes, only empathy. "Of course," she said gently. "Let's get you settled. We'll figure this out together." Tanya exhaled, the first real breath she'd taken in what felt like days. She followed Mrs. Green to a small lounge area where families were gathered, some resting on cots, others sipping coffee or reading books to their children. It wasn't home, but it was safe, and that was more than Tanya had dared hope for. Over the next few hours, Tanya and her children began to relax, the tension of the last day slowly easing away. Malik and Keisha played quietly in a corner with a few donated toys, their laughter a welcome sound after the silence of the night before. Tanya sat with Mrs. Green at a small table, explaining her situation in more detail. Mrs. Green listened carefully, nodding thoughtfully as Tanya spoke. "We'll help you find some resources," she said kindly. "And if you're interested, we have a few job openings here at the shelter. It's not much, but it's a start." Tanya blinked, surprised by the offer. "You'd hire me?" "Of course," Mrs. Green said with a smile. "We believe in helping people get back on their feet, and it sounds like you could use a fresh start." Tanya felt a lump rise in her throat, but this time it wasn't from fear, it was from gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, blinking back tears. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope flickered in Tanya's heart. She still had a long way to go, but at least now she had a direction. As night fell once more, Tanya tucked her children into a pair of cots provided by the shelter. She sat on the edge of Malik's cot, stroking his hair as he drifted off to sleep. Keisha was already snuggled under her blanket, her breathing soft and even. Tanya sat in the quiet for a moment, her thoughts turning to Officer Clark. She wondered if he had given them a second thought since the eviction. If he ever wondered what happened to the families he displaced. Probably not, she thought with a sigh. To him, it was just another task on his list, just another family to check off and forget. But Tanya wasn't one to dwell on anger. It wouldn't help her children, and it wouldn't change what had already happened. Instead, she focused on what she could control, moving forward, finding stability, and making sure her children never had to experience this again. And as she lay down on her own cot that night, listening to the soft sounds of her children breathing beside her, Tanya made a silent promise. No matter what, she would find a way to rebuild their lives. This was just a setback, a painful, exhausting setback. But it wasn't the end. She closed her eyes, holding on to that promise, and for the first time in days, sleep came easily. The morning at the shelter began early, the hum of quiet conversations and the clatter of dishes creating a soft rhythm that eased Tanya awake. She rubbed her eyes and glanced over at Malik and Keisha, who were still sound asleep, their small forms curled under thin blankets. For a moment she felt a twinge of sadness. This wasn't where they were supposed to be. But a spark of determination flickered in her chest. This was only temporary. Things would get better. Mrs. Green greeted Tanya warmly as she made her way to the communal kitchen for breakfast. "Good morning," she said, handing Tanya a cup of coffee. "How are the little ones holding up?" Tanya smiled weakly. "They're doing okay, considering." She glanced toward her kids, grateful that they had managed to sleep through the night without much fuss. "Thank you again for everything. I don't know what we would have done without you." Mrs. Green waved her hand dismissively. "You don't have to thank me. That's what we're here for. And remember, the offer for the job still stands." Tanya hesitated. The thought of working at the shelter had been on her mind all night. It wasn't the job she had imagined for herself, but it was an opportunity, one she couldn't afford to pass up. "I'd like to try," she said quietly, "if you'll have me." Mrs. Green beamed. "Wonderful. We'll get you started today. You can help with organizing supplies and talking to the families. You'll be perfect." Tanya's first day at the shelter was a whirlwind. She met families from all walks of life, some who had lost their homes to sudden illness, others who had been laid off with no savings to fall back on. Each story was a reminder of how fragile stability could be. As she worked alongside Mrs. Green and the other volunteers, Tanya felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. Throughout the day, Malik and Keisha stayed close, playing with the other children at the shelter and slowly warming to their new surroundings. Their laughter echoed through the halls, a soothing sound that filled Tanya's heart with cautious hope. While helping sort donations in the afternoon, Tanya noticed something unexpected. A familiar face among the volunteers. Officer Clark stood by one of the tables, unpacking boxes of canned food. He looked just as surprised to see her as she was to see him. "Tanya," he said, awkwardly adjusting his grip on a can of soup. "I didn't expect to see you here." Tanya straightened, her heart pounding. For a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. A part of her wanted to lash out at him, to make him understand the pain his actions had caused. But another part of her, the part that had learned the value of resilience, held back. "I didn't expect to see you here either," she said finally, her voice even. Clark shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the tension between them. "Look, about what happened. I'm sorry," he said. "I was just following orders. It's not an excuse, I know, but I didn't mean for things to end up the way they did." Tanya folded her arms, studying him carefully. She could see the regret in his eyes, but she wasn't ready to let him off the hook just yet. "What did you think was going to happen to us?" she asked quietly. "Did you even wonder where we'd go, or were we just another name on a list to you?" Clark looked down, shame flickering across his face. "Honestly, I didn't think about it. I should have. I've done this so many times, and after a while, it all starts to feel the same. But seeing you here, it's different." Tanya didn't know what to say. She had spent the last day resenting him, blaming him for everything. But now, standing in front of him, she saw something she hadn't expected. Remorse. "Maybe it's not too late to think differently," she said softly. "These are people's lives, Officer Clark. We're not just cases to close." He nodded slowly, as if her words had struck a chord deep within him. "You're right," he admitted. "I guess I needed to see it from the other side to really understand." As the day went on, Tanya found herself working alongside Clark more than she had anticipated. At first, the interactions were brief, polite exchanges as they sorted donations or assisted families. But slowly, the walls between them began to lower. Clark asked questions about her kids, and Tanya, to her own surprise, found herself answering. "They're tough," she said with a small smile, glancing over at Malik and Keisha as they played with a group of children. "They don't let much get them down." Clark smiled too, a genuine expression that made him seem less like the stern officer she had met at her doorstep and more like a regular person. "They must get that from you," he said quietly. Tanya looked away, uncomfortable with the compliment. "I just do what I have to," she murmured. They worked in silence for a while after that, but it was a comfortable silence, one that hinted at the possibility of understanding. Clark wasn't the villain Tanya had painted him to be in her mind, and she wasn't just another problem for him to solve. They were two people, both trying to navigate the complexities of life the best way they knew how. Later that evening, after the last of the families had settled in for the night, Clark approached Tanya again. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, rubbing the back of his neck nervously. "About seeing people as more than just cases." Tanya raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. "I want to do better," he admitted. "I don't want to be the kind of officer who just follows orders without thinking about the impact. I want to make things right." Tanya studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Making things right isn't about words, Officer Clark," she said finally. "It's about actions." Clark nodded, understanding the challenge in her words. "I know, and I intend to prove it." By the end of the day, something unexpected had begun to shift between Tanya and Clark. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something better. For the first time, Tanya saw the possibility that maybe, just maybe, people could change. And for Clark, the encounter with Tanya was a wake-up call, a reminder that his job wasn't just about enforcing the law, but about serving the people behind the paperwork. As Tanya tucked her children into bed that night, she felt a strange sense of calm. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she wasn't walking it alone. The following week at the shelter brought a steady rhythm to Tanya's days. Each morning, she woke her children, helped them dress, and made sure they had breakfast before diving into her tasks. The work was hard, but it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. More importantly, it kept her moving forward, one step at a time. What surprised her the most, though, was how often she found herself working alongside Officer Clark. At first, they exchanged only brief, polite greetings, but gradually, they began to talk more. Short conversations about the families they helped, about Malik and Tisha's antics, even about life in general. Clark seemed genuinely interested in making a difference, and although Tanya still carried the sting of their eviction, she found herself softening toward him, little by little. One afternoon, they found themselves setting up chairs for a community meeting hosted by the shelter. The event was meant to connect local residents, law enforcement, and volunteers, fostering dialogue between the people who lived in the neighborhood and the officers who served there. Clark adjusted a folding chair, glancing sideways at Tanya. "I have to admit, I've never been to one of these meetings before," he said with a sheepish smile. "It's different being here as a participant, not just as a cop." Tanya smirked, unable to resist a small jab. "Well, maybe it's time you started showing up." Clark chuckled. "Fair enough. I deserve that." Despite the lingering tension between them, their conversations had grown easier. Tanya still carried the weight of the past week, the fear, the anger, the uncertainty, but she also saw that Clark was trying. He was awkward, yes, but there was an earnestness about him that was hard to ignore. The meeting began, drawing a small crowd of residents and volunteers. A few local officers joined, sitting in the back of the room, their postures stiff. Tanya stood near the front, arms crossed, listening as the discussion unfolded. Residents spoke about their experiences. Some shared stories of positive encounters with law enforcement, while others recounted moments of mistrust and frustration. When it was Clark's turn to speak, he stood slowly, the eyes of the room fixed on him. Tanya could see the nervousness in his stance, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. But when he began to speak, his voice was steady. "I've been a cop for over 10 years, Clark said. "And if I'm being honest, I used to think my job was just about following the rules, about doing what needed to be done, no questions asked. But recently, I've realized that it's not enough to just follow orders. It's about understanding the people behind those orders." His eyes flicked to Tanya just for a moment, and she felt the weight of his words. He wasn't just talking to the room, he was talking to her. "There's a difference between enforcing the law and serving the people," Clark continued. "And I'm learning that I need to do more of the latter. I can't change the past, but I can try to do better going forward." The room was silent for a beat, absorbing his words. Then, slowly, a few people began to nod in quiet approval. Clark's words weren't revolutionary, but they were sincere, and sincerity was something people didn't often see in officers. Tanya watched him carefully, feeling a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. She wanted to be angry still, wanted to hold on to the resentment she had carried since the eviction. But as she stood there, listening to him take ownership of his actions, she realized that holding on to that anger wouldn't change anything. Clark wasn't perfect, but he was trying. And in a world full of people who never tried at all, that counted for something. After the meeting, Tanya found herself standing beside Clark as the crowd dispersed. The two of them lingered in the empty room, folding chairs in comfortable silence. "I meant what I said," Clark said quietly, glancing at her. "I'm sorry for how things went down. I didn't really see you, until it was too late, and that's on me." Tanya leaned against one of the chairs, folding her arms across her chest. "You can't change what happened," she said, "but maybe you can change what happens next." Clark nodded, understanding the weight of her words. "That's the plan," he said simply. Tanya studied him for a moment, then gave a small, reluctant smile. "Good." Over the next few days, Clark continued to show up, not just physically, but emotionally. He volunteered more at the shelter, getting to know the families and offering support beyond his badge. He even took time to play with Malik and Keisha, much to their delight. Seeing him interact with her children, Tanya couldn't help but feel the beginnings of something unexpected, a tentative trust. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a start. One evening, as the shelter began to wind down for the night, Clark approached Tanya with an idea. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the families here, the ones on the edge of losing everything. What if we started an early intervention program? Something to help people before they reach the point of eviction." Tanya raised an eyebrow. "An intervention program? What do you mean? Financial counseling? Emergency assistance? That sort of thing," Clark explained. "We could work with landlords to create flexible payment plans and offer resources to families before things spiral out of control. It's not a perfect solution, but it could make a difference." Tanya considered his words, impressed by his thoughtfulness. "That could actually work," she admitted. "If we could get landlords on board, it might save a lot of families." Clark smiled, a genuine expression of hope. "I'll make it happen," he promised. Tanya couldn't help but smile back. For the first time since their paths had crossed, she felt like they were on the same side. Two people working toward a common goal, united by the desire to make things better. That night, as Tanya tucked her children into bed, she reflected on how far they had come in such a short time. A week ago, she had felt lost, angry, and betrayed. But now, she felt something else. Something she hadn't expected to feel so soon. Hope. Life was still unpredictable, still filled with challenges. But for the first time, she felt like she wasn't facing it alone. Clark wasn't just an officer following orders anymore. He was someone trying to make a difference, not just in his job, but in her life, and in the lives of others. And that, Tanya realized, was a kind of redemption all its own. Weeks passed, and the small intervention program Clark and Tanya envisioned together began to take shape. Tanya threw herself into the work, coordinating meetings with families and landlords, researching local grants, and building a network of support services. Clark used his connections within the police department to advocate for the program, persuading officers and city officials to get involved. Slowly, the idea gained traction, and what started as a small initiative at the shelter began to grow into something with real impact. The transformation was not only in the program, but also in the people involved. Clark, once a detached officer who saw eviction as a routine part of his job, became deeply invested in the families they helped. He listened to their stories, connected them with resources, and fought to ensure they were treated with dignity. His change was not just professional but personal. He was learning to see people for who they were, not just as files on a desk or names on a list. Tanya, too, felt herself changing. She no longer carried the anger and resentment she had clung to after her eviction. Instead, she found fulfillment in the work she was doing, knowing that she was helping to prevent other families from going through the same hardship she had endured. It wasn't always easy. There were setbacks and challenges along the way. But with each family they helped, Tanya felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just a little more. One day, as they prepared for an important meeting with local landlords, Clark approached Tanya with a thoughtful expression. "I've been meaning to ask," he began, his tone careful. "Have you thought about where you see yourself in the future? Beyond the shelter, I mean? Tanya paused, caught off guard by the question. It had been a long time since she had thought about the future in anything other than survival mode. For so long, her focus had been on getting through the day, making sure her children were safe and fed. But now, with some stability in place, the idea of the future didn't seem as distant as it once had. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I guess I've just been taking things one step at a time." Clark nodded, as if he understood exactly what she meant. "Well, whatever you decide to do, I think you'll make a difference," he said. "You already are." Tanya gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Clark. That means a lot." It was a simple exchange, but it carried more weight than either of them realized. In those few words, a bridge had been built, not just between Tanya and Clark, but between their past and their future. The following week, the shelter hosted a community event to celebrate the launch of the early intervention program. Families, volunteers, and local officials gathered in the shelter's courtyard, sharing food, stories, and laughter. For many, it was the first time in a long while that they felt hopeful about the future. Tanya stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as Malik and Keisha played with other children, their faces bright with joy. Mrs. Green stood beside her, a proud smile on her face. "You've done a good thing here, Tanya," she said warmly. "This program is going to help a lot of people." Tanya nodded, her heart swelling with a sense of accomplishment she hadn't felt in years. "I couldn't have done it without you," she replied. Mrs. Green chuckled. "Nonsense. You had it in you all along. You just needed a little push." Tanya smiled, knowing that Mrs. Green was right. The strength she had found, the resilience, the determination, it had always been there. She just needed the right circumstances to bring it to the surface. As the event wound down, Tanya found herself standing with Clark near the entrance to the shelter. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the courtyard. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the families around them begin to pack up and head home. "You know," Clark said thoughtfully, "when I first showed up at your door with that eviction notice, I never imagined we'd end up here." Tanya laughed softly. "Me neither." Clark looked at her, his expression serious. "I know I can't undo what happened that day, Tanya, but I hope we've built something good out of it." Tanya met his gaze, feeling a sense of closure settle over her. "We have," she said simply, "and that's what matters." Clark smiled, and in that moment, Tanya knew that things were different now. They had both grown, both changed. Their journey wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had found a way forward. Together, they had turned a moment of hardship into an opportunity for growth, and in doing so, they had created a ripple of change that would continue to spread. That night, as Tanya tucked Malik and Keisha into bed, she reflected on everything that had happened. Life had thrown them into a storm, but they had weathered it. They had found shelter, not just in a building, but in the people who had stood by them, in Mrs. Green, in Clark, and in the families they had helped along the way. For the first time in a long while, Tanya felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the end of their story. There was still much to do, still challenges to face, but it was a new beginning, and that was enough. As she lay down on her own bed, listening to the soft breaths of her sleeping children, Tanya made a silent promise to herself. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same strength and determination that had brought her here. She had found her way through the darkness, and now she was ready for whatever the future held. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.